now. So thank you for joining us this evening at the CSH seminar. My name is Laurence Gauthier and I'm a historian here. So this evening, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Emar Sharan. Emar Sharan is assistant professor at the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Maryland in College Park. And he completed his PhD from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Global Development. His research, which is based in India and especially in Bihar, focuses on inequality in socially diverse settings. He looks at how institutional and technological innovations could empower marginalized groups. So for instance, he has worked on grievance redressal mechanisms and the role of local government actors in making them more effective. He's also worked on the consequences of reservation for Dalits in village local governments, on the consequences of reservation for women, on corruption and development outcomes, and for example, on programs identifying the poor. In addition to research in economics, he also wrote a nonfiction book on village politics in Bihar entitled Lost Among Equals, which was published last year by Westland. And he also published a novel, Blue, published by HarperCollins in 2014. This evening, the title of his presentation is Caste, Collective Action and Local Government, Learnings from Bihar. But before I let him speak, I would like to introduce his discussant. So to discuss his work today, we are happy to have Dr. Rahul Verma, who's a research fellow at CPR at the Center for Policy Research, and also a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Ashoka University. Rahul co-authored a book with Pradeep Chibar entitled Ideology and Identity, The Changing Party Systems of India, which was published by OUP in 2018. He has also published several journal articles on voting behavior, party politics, political violence, and the media, and writes regular columns for various newspapers. So this evening, we are delighted to welcome both of them. And let me remind you once more the title of this presentation. So the paper is entitled Caste, Collective Action, and Local Government, Learnings from Bihar. This presentation will be followed by a discussion and then by a Q&A with the public. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks so much, Lawrence, for the introduction. Thank you, Himanshu, for inviting me and everyone else who've come here. I'm really happy to be giving this talk. When I asked Himanshu about how to pitch it, he said, don't make it too econ style. So I've tried to kind of bring in elements that are not only from economics. It's still going to be a bit econ heavy in the beginning. So, but I want you to all focus on the story and not so much on the data and the empirics. Next slide. Okay, so this is going to be a talk in kind of three parts. I'm going to kind of talk about three different ways in which one can kind of empower the rural marginalized in Bihar. These are all examples of policies or things that I have observed. So these are not the only three things that you can do. This is not exhaustive. It's not even mutually exclusive as the kind of Venn diagram shows here. But basically there are three policies. So first I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk, actually the first half of the talk, on how reservation kind of affected a whole bunch of development outcomes in Bihar, including poverty alleviation and political empowerment at the local level. I'm also going to spend some time talking about Bihar's kind of self-help group, Rural Livelihoods Mission-based JEEViKA program, which is kind of state-supported collective action. That's how I'm kind of framing it. I'm happy to take comments on whether or not you agree with that kind of framing. And then towards the end, I'll spend maybe just a few slides, maybe 2 or 3 slides on kind of organic, spontaneous collective action movement, which is the Muzaffarpur People's Movement. This is a movement that I have kind of both been associated with and studied for almost a decade. Between the three of these things, next slide, what you'll basically see is that, reservation as a policy of empowering the marginalized can be seen as being a top-down policy that someone above decides that, a fraction of seats at the village government level will be reserved for members of marginalized groups. So that's more a top-down policy. The JEEViKA policy, which is the state-supported collective action, is top-down in the sense that it's still supported by the state, and in this instance, the World Bank, but it's also bottom-up because it encourages women in villages to kind of come together and help each other out. So it's collective action bottom-up, but also kind of top-down. And then the Muzaffarpur movement is going to be almost entirely bottom-up. It's rural wage labor workers coming together to kind of petition the local state to provide welfare benefits and also public goods in their villages. Next slide. And so what I'm going to show you here is the reservation piece will be kind of mostly quantitative analysis. All the qualitative stuff I'm going to add on to that piece is going to be things that I have seen over the years. This is a paper that I've worked on for almost 7-8 years, and I'm still revising it. This is with my co-author Chinmay Kumar on the JEEViKA piece. This is something I'm kind of excited about. I've been working with them, with the government of Bihar, on this a bit over the last couple of years, and that's kind of some very early stage quantitative results and some qualitative work. And then the Muzaffarpur work will be mostly qualitative. The idea is to, as I kind of just want to reiterate here, the idea is to show how you can have different methods of trying to empower rural marginalized, both top down and bottom up. Okay, next slide. So the setting is Bihar. It's amongst India's poorest states. I'm guessing many in this room know this. The most important marginalized groups I'll focus on for the purpose of this talk is Dalits, who are scheduled castes, who are at the bottom of the caste hierarchy and comprise about 17% of the population in Bihar. The other group I'll focus on is also women, because the rural self-help group, the JEEViKA movement, is primarily women, and so is the Muzaffarpur People's Movement, which also is 80-90% women. And in terms of the structure of local government, just so that it's easier for you to follow everything I'll say in this talk, Bihar basically has 38 districts, which are divided into 534 blocks. Each of these blocks are further divided into 8,400 panchayats. Roughly, this number is reduced. Right now, it's about 8,100. And panchayats are essentially village local self-government units. Okay, so this is all of this talk will focus on rural Bihar, and much of this will kind of revolve around this local self-government unit called panchayats. And in particular, we'll spend some time thinking about the elected head of the panchayat, who's called the mukhya, who's the most important local government official. They are usually the officials tasked with implementing a whole host of development programs and also disbursing funds. And, basically they control how local development occurs to a large extent in Bihar. Okay, next slide. So here's one motivating slide for why we should care about Dalits in Bihar. So this is from the data source, the Socioeconomic Caste Census 2011-12. This is a data source that many in this room, including Himanshu, will be very familiar with. What I do in this graph, and maybe if you minimize the Zoom thing, you can, the window, you can probably see the other things. So this is basically plotting what I call asset scores by surnames. Okay, and so the red surnames are surnames of all Dalits, and the blue ones are non-Dalits, and so Dalits are scheduled castes or SCs. And an asset score basically ranges from 0 to 8, I think. And so this plots the average asset score. It's a very simple asset score. It just takes the 8 most common assets. Actually, it's 6, sorry, not 8, 6 most common assets owned by people in Bihar. So this includes, say, a phone, a concrete roof, a cement wall, a vehicle, irrigation equipment, and basically, and land owned. It's a binary variable on whether the household owns any land or not. And so it just sums up across those 6 things. It's a very basic score. The idea is to just give you a sense of, how these various castes kind of plot along these asset dimensions. And what you're seeing here is that the 8 poorest surnames, and in the SECC, I'm proxying Jati or subcaste by surname. The 8 poorest surnames out of this list of about 48 are all SCs. Okay, so they are completely at the bottom of the hierarchy. And if you look at the top half, you hardly see any SC surname. So in particular, scheduled castes, are not just at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, they're also completely at the bottom of the asset wealth hierarchy. Even today, this is, 75 years after independence. This survey must be about 60 years after independence. Even now, scheduled castes continue to lag behind most other groups. Okay. So, yeah, next slide. So with that out of the way, let's kind of think about reservations in local government. So in 2006, Bihar actually introduced reservation for the post of mukhyas, ward members, sarpanches, panches. I'm not going to focus on anyone else but the mukhya here. And up to 17% of seats were reserved for Dalits, up to 20% for extremely backward classes, 45% for women. Bihar introduced reservations much later than most states. The one other laggard was Jharkhand, not very surprising, I guess, because they are kind of neighboring states and they were part of one whole for a long time. The path to securing reservations in Bihar and also Jharkhand was fraught. And I want to spend maybe just a minute kind of telling you why the path was so fraught. So when in 93, it was decided that panchayats should have locally elected leaders and there must be reservations of up to 16% across all panchayats in Bihar, for example, based on the share of Dalits in the state. Most other states in the country kind of went ahead and implemented reservations. Bihar didn't. And Bihar didn't because there was a challenge in the High Court that made the case that every village in India, and therefore in Bihar, is an independent republic. This was a thing that Mahatma Gandhi said in the 1930s. He kind of envisioned an India where all villages were independent republics and they all kind of functioned on their own and they were all kind of completely they could satisfy their own needs without having to rely on anyone else. And the Panchayati Raj framework kind of owes a lot to Gandhi, but at no point did Gandhi envision all villages of Bihar being completely independent in themselves. But the people who opposed reservation basically made the claim that if every village is an independent reservation, is an independent republic, then how can you reserve 1/6 of one? So if you have to reserve 16% of seats and there's only one mukhya in every republic, how can you reserve 1/6 of that? So it was a clearly kind of mathematical legal jugglery that should not have had any kind of standing in court, but it took a whole 10 to 12 years for this particular argument to be quashed, and Bihar finally only had reservations come out in 2006, much later than most other states. In fact, one of the other things that one of the early judgments also said was that the poison of reservation will actually divide society, and so therefore we should be particularly careful about introducing reservation in panchayat. So this is all to say that the path to reservations was kind of fraught. But anyway, in 2006, finally reservations were introduced. Yeah, next slide. So this is joint work with Chinmay Kumar. What we do is we kind of just focus on the post of the mukhya and also only focus on Dalits. And then we ask basically, how did reservation affect a whole bunch of outcomes? So access to public goods, private assets, political empowerment in the short and long run. And this is amongst the early papers to kind of quantitatively study the long run effects of reservation at the village level. Part of the reason this is the case is because it's mechanical. Reservations were only introduced in the 90s in Panchayat. So, the long run is now. In Bihar, we kind of have reservations introduced in 2006 and we have outcomes all the way till 2020 in this paper. Next slide. I'll just kind of spend maybe a minute talking about how we do, how we measure the impact of reservation. So here's a very stylized version of a causal empirical strategy that in econometrics is called a regression discontinuity design. I will not talk about any of this technical stuff in this talk, but let me just give you a sense of what we're doing. So think of these as kind of five images of panchayats. Each of these panchayats has these elected representatives called the mukhyas, and let's say that they're all arranged in ascending order of population. So the of SC population, so Dalit population. So the one on the left has the fewest amount of Dalits, and the one on the right has the highest amount of Dalits. When you look at the kind of stylized images of citizens there, the ones in red are the Dalits. So you can see that as you go from left to right, the number of kind of red figures you see kind of increase. And essentially what Bihar did was they defined a population threshold of SCs in a GP, in a Gram Panchayat, and said that any Panchayat above that threshold will now have a Dalit Mukhya. Next slide, and I'll show you what that means. That basically means that these two villages on the right of the threshold now, by law, are supposed to have a Dalit head, and the other three don't have a Dalit head. Next slide. And so what we do is, essentially, we are doing this comparison between two panchayats that look, or two or maybe three at best, panchayats that are very close to the threshold. One got reserved and the other didn't. And so that's basically a stylized version of what we do, in much more fancy econometric jargony way. But essentially what we're doing is looking at panchayats that look very similar. It just so happened that one fell on the right side of the threshold, and so got by law Dalit Mukhya, and the one on the left didn't get a Dalit leader. So that's basically the types of panchayats we are comparing. Next slide. So what this graph basically tells you, and this is usually for an economics audience, you want to convince everybody that the rule was followed. So on the x-axis, you have distance from the threshold population. So let's say, and we've kind of normalized that threshold population to 0. So to the below that threshold population, the probability of reservation basically is 0. That's what the x-axis is telling you, and the y is basically close to 0. On the right of the threshold, the probability of reservation is almost 1. If the rule were followed perfectly, the probability of reservation would be exactly 1 to the right of the threshold. But there were some panchayats, a very small number, where the rule was not perfectly followed. But this basically convinces you that the rule was followed. We're basically now going to compare panchayats very close to that 0 number there, that just happened to fall either on the left or on the right. And then we're going to see what happens to outcomes 5, 10, 15 years after reservation was introduced. Next slide. Oh, I think you have to click on the. You have to click on the screen because Zoom got activated. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, no one can see this, so I'm going to, maybe you can, I don't know. But this is basically a timeline of all the data sources that we kind of bring together in this paper. So in 2006, reservations were introduced. So we have, the data on who the leaders of the village were and all of that stuff. In 2010-11, the census of India happened. So we can actually look at public goods. We focus on 4 main important public goods that Mukhyas told us that they could actually influence. So these are Anganwadi centers, schools, roads, and the location of the PDS shop. So we have data on all of this for all of Bihar's 8,000 odd panchayats and 45,000 villages. And then we also have the data from the 2011 elections. Remember, reservation, and this is something I haven't told you, so you won't remember, but now let me tell you, in 2006, reservation was introduced, but reservation was kind of fixed for 2 terms. So essentially, once a panchayat was reserved in 2006, even in 2011, even though there would be elections, the seat would still be reserved for only SC candidates could contest, only Dalits could contest. So we have data on that. We also have data from the socioeconomic caste census, which is basically the asset scores I showed you earlier, all comes from the caste census. And this is across 2 crore households. So we have data on all of them. Across Bihar, 20 million, 19 million roughly. We also have data on the NREGA outcomes for 2014 to 16. So this is just before the reservation cycle switched. Then we have data on the subsequent election cycle, but now these panchayats are no longer reserved. Subsequently, we have some data on public goods between 2016 and 18, which is basically water and sanitation public goods. Ideally, we would have wanted census data also from the next round, but as many in this room will know, there's probably not going to be a census till we all go. So, it just feels like it's never going to happen. Then we also have data on, housing, and we also have data on we actually did the last row is interesting because we actually did a primary survey. So we went back to these villages, not all of them, about 100 of them in 2018-19, and we surveyed 8,000 households, and we asked them the same about the same assets that we use in the SECC. So socioeconomic caste census, we have a bunch of assets. We go back in 2018-19, and we go back to some of these villages, and then we ask them about asset ownership. So that's our long run asset outcome. So it's a lot of data we put together, all of which to kind of causally estimate the effects of reservation. Next slide. Okay, so this is a regression table. I'm going to interpret the coefficients for you. The effects on private assets and public goods is the first thing. So the first thing I'll say is that overall, in terms of just private assets across all SCs, you find no effects. Okay, so sorry, this is not all SCs, this is all households in the panchayat. It's almost a very precise 0. So 5 years after reservation was introduced, it's not that the average person in the village is doing better. However, if you look at the difference in asset ownership between SCs and non-SCs, that improves in reserved places. So that 0.084 in the second column is basically telling you that SC minus others asset scores, so relative asset scores for SCs increases by about 0.85 standard deviations. All of these outcomes are in standard deviations, so that it's just easy to think about them. In the long run, the effects are huge. It's almost an increase of over 1 standard deviation. So when we go back to these villages 13 years later, what we're seeing is SCs are really catching up with non-SCs in the long run. Even if you think that, it's just an artifact of the fact that we don't have that much data in the long run, and we are collecting the data as opposed to, the government. Even if you take the lower bound, so you take the 95% confidence interval of that 1 standard deviation result, and you take the lower bound on that, it's still about 0.3 standard deviations. And if you work with data and development, you know that 0.3 standard deviations is a very big effect. It's basically saying that SCs move up in the asset distributions by about 2 deciles. Okay, so it's a pretty big effect there. In terms of public goods, in the short run, we again find no effects overall. So it's not like more roads, more schools, more Anganwadi centers are being built. That's not happening. But in the main SC village, within the Gram Panchayat, so there are multiple villages in the Gram Panchayat. In the main SC village, you're seeing public goods kind of go up by about 0.2 standard deviation. And that's also true for these water and sanitation goods in the long run. So that's a whole new program. So that's the final column. It's SC Village long run. It's a different program. It's not the same assets that were collected in the census. It's a water and sanitation, basically village roads and drains. And even that improves. And remember, in the long run, reservation has actually switched. So this is now post there being reserved, panchayat or leaders from Dalit backgrounds in these places, but even then you see kind of better implementation of public good projects in the long run. Next slide. And so why is this happening? So one of the reasons we think is that, there's better political participation of Dalits. So what we do for this is we take the 2016 panchayat elections and we look at Dalit candidates contesting in Mukhya and ward seats. Ward is 1 tier below the Mukhya. So there are 13 wards in any panchayat. And what column 1 is saying there, and now it's no longer in standard deviations, these are absolute numbers. What first column there is saying is that in GPs that were reserved for 10 years, you are 11 percentage point likelier to have a Dalit Mukhya compared to control. Look at the control mean, which is the mean in under column 1. That's basically 0.019, which is 1.9%. So only 1.9% of unreserved panchayats have a Dalit Mukhya. But if you have reservation for 10 years in a panchayat, and then that goes up to about 13%, right? 1.9 plus 11.6. So that's a very big effect. It's basically telling you that you're creating almost a whole new class of Dalit political candidates. And that's not just true of winners, it's true of candidates at the panchayat level, and it's also true of winners at the panchayat level, at the ward level. So in the ward level, even in unreserved seats, you're seeing more candidates kind of contesting and winning and all of that. So basically what you're seeing here is that in the short run, there's increase in assets modestly. There's better targeting of public goods. In the long run, you're seeing increase in assets and public goods and better political participation. Next slide. One slide before. Yeah. So one of the questions then is, how does this happen? And I'm not going to show you results on this, but we show in our paper that, there's better actually targeting of welfare schemes. So Indra Awas Yojana, NREGA, Indra Awas Yojana is the housing scheme, NREGA, all of these outcomes kind of improve by about 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviations for SCs. We also find some evidence of clientelistic behaviors. What I mean by this is some, imagine that within the SCs, certain households get elected as being the Mukhya. then those households, so either if you share the same surname, if you live in the neighborhood of that of the winning Mukhia's household, or if you come from the same village, you're much likelier to benefit than if you're SC but you don't live close to the Mukhya. So this is kind of classic clientelism. We see evidence of this, especially in the short run. We don't have evidence of this in the long run. That would have been great to see. But the fact that we see it in the short run suggests to us that even in the long run, you'll see some of this. But we are reasonably confident that even accounting for this, the benefits are huge. It's not that all the effects we're seeing only comes from those close to the Mukhya. And there's absolutely no evidence on, just say the non-Mahadalits benefiting. So Bihar has a category of SCs called Mahadalits, who are the lowest SCs in the sense that they are the most disadvantaged amongst the Dalits, and they have a separate grouping. And if you just look at outcomes for them, it's not that they are doing better or worse or than say the non-Mahadalits in the same GP. So it's like everybody benefits because of reservation. It is true that in some GPs, the Mahadalit leader gets elected, and so therefore their kith and kin and their neighbors do better. But it's not true that on average, one type of SC is benefiting more than the other. Okay, so that's the next slide. So this is a question that's interesting. So where does reservation work best? So the way to think about this is that in India itself, you have like, 20, now I think you have over 30 states, and each of these states has a reservation implemented. But the proportion of Dalits in each of these states vary, right? So in some states, you have under 5% Dalits. And then in states like, I think Punjab has nearly 30% Dalits. So given that there's so much variation, one of the questions you can think of is, where is it that, a policy like reservation may work best? What we do have from the Bihar context is a way of kind of approximating an answer to that question. How are we able to do this? Next slide, I'll show you what basically we do. Essentially, what I told you earlier was kind of a super stylized version of what the true comparison we are doing. So as I told you, Bihar had 534 blocks, and within blocks there are panchayats. The thing I didn't tell you was each block has a separate SC population threshold. So there's a separate. So in one block the threshold will be 500. So there'll be few SCs. And so the panchayat that has a population right above 500 will be reserved, and right below won't be reserved. And that's the comparison we're making. Next slide. And then there'll be another block where, you have 2,300 SCs around the threshold, and panchayats right above this 2,200 figure will be reserved, and those below 2,200 won't be reserved. So what this allows us to do is to kind of ask the question, does reservation work better when you have 2,200 SCs in your GP, which is roughly, in this case, it'll be about 23% of the overall population, or does it work better when there are only 500 SCs in your GP, which is roughly about 4 to 5% of the population? Next slide. I'm just going to show you the histogram of the kind of distribution of thresholds. You can see here that it varies at the very bottom from about 500 and goes up all the way to about 4,000, right? So there's a separate population cutoff for each block. So we can actually kind of now break our entire sample into 3 different groups: the low SC threshold group, the middle SC threshold group, and the high SC threshold group. And then we can ask, well, where does reservation work best? Next slide. And what we find here is that one before. That's okay. Okay, let me give you the, because it feels like yeah. So you can't see it anyway. So so I'm so I'm so sorry about this. It should be bigger, but essentially I'm going to read out what's there because I broadly have a sense. It's the middle set of GPs. So where SCs are not too large, nor too small, that's where you see the best effects of reservation. In the sense that in terms of material gains and public good benefits, even when SCs are a small proportion of the population, things actually improve, but they're unable to be politically empowered in the long run. And so therefore, long run outcomes are not that good. When SCs are a really big chunk of the population, nothing really changes. I mean, things change, but by not that much. Whereas when SCs are neither too big nor too small, they're just small enough that they benefit from reservation, and they're actually able to kind of make policy moves that help them in the short run and in the medium run. But they're also large enough that they can materially gain from the absence of reservation, in the sense that they've now been empowered for long enough that their numbers are not so small that they don't have a vote bank. So they capitalize on the fact that they were historically reserved and they have some numbers, and so therefore they have political empowerment. I'll just tell you a bit more. Next slide. On this result, so that it's kind of easier to digest. Okay. So so let me just kind of just like reiterate that result, right? So why is it that the middle tier of SCs do the best? Because these SCs are not a political base by themselves, such that they will benefit even if there's no reservation. So if SCs are 25% of the population or 30% of the population, they're a political constituency by themselves that no non-SC leader can kind of ignore them. So now when you're the middle tier, you are kind of, when you get reservation, you can actually move benefits towards you. However, in the long run, you're not so small that you can't win elections you can win elections even in the absence of reservation. Because your population is not so small. Whereas in the cases where SCs are really tiny share of the overall population, they do benefit a lot from reservation in terms of material gains in the short run and getting public goods, but they're too tiny a vote base to kind of win elections on their own in the absence of reservation. So that's why that middle tier really kind of is where you see biggest impacts. So what this paper basically says is that, there's a virtuous cycle between political empowerment and material benefits. And that's something to kind of think about, right? You have quotas for 10 years, and then you don't need quotas always to kind of help Dalits kind of continue to kind of reap the benefits of empowerment. However, the thing to think about is reservation is kind of a blunt instrument in some sense, in the sense that you can only apply it to about 16% of GPs at any given point of time, but SCs exist. And, I wanted to put in a map here showing you how SCs exist in practically every single block and every single village of Bihar. So they're everywhere. And so given that Dalits are everywhere in Bihar, how do you kind of, what kind of policies can you envision that kind of helps them in places where there's no reservation? That's a question to think about. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the next couple of things. So the first thing is the state-supported collective action, as I was saying. Next slide. And there it's essentially this thing called JEEViKA. I'm guessing many people in this room know about JEEViKA. JEEViKA is essentially Bihar's kind of standout self-help group program. Next slide. It essentially, the original idea was, can women from marginalized communities actually come together to help each other? So that's the big guiding idea behind JEEViKA. And the original purpose, at least when it was launched in 2006, was to get groups of 10 to 12 women to come sit together. The state, with the help of the World Bank, would kind of give 30,000 rupees as a rotating fund to start with. People borrow from the fund on a need-to basis, and they also kind of put in money into the fund if they want to lend to someone else. People borrow on kind of very low interest rates. Typically, over a period of 2-3 years, groups are kind of agglomerated into federations where, groups of self-help groups kind of form their own larger cluster federation. And, while microloans is basically what it started off with, right now there's several other facets. In fact, the joke in Bihar is that, any problem you have, you throw the SHG group at it, and then hopefully that solves the problem. So, right now there's livelihood trainings, entrepreneurship, but they are doing everything from distributing masks to, you name the thing, and there's an SHG doing something there. But the reason why this is a collective action thing, and it's a bottom-up force, is because you have these women, especially from marginalized groups, kind of meeting every week. And when you meet every week, you're not only going to discuss how much money goes to whom, you're also typically going to discuss a whole bunch of other problems that you face in your daily existence. So that could kind of lead to some kind of empowerment by itself. And so next slide. What I think is remarkable about JEEViKA is how rapidly it expanded. So it started in 2006. It was in 6 districts until 2011. And about 11% of the villages had JEEViKA, or 20% of the villages had JEEViKA in 2011. That's now moved up to 92% in 2021. But most of that expansion actually happened between 11 and 15 or 16. And so, it really expanded. Suddenly you had these groups going everywhere. In fact, the thing that really amazed me when I started working on JEEViKA, next slide, is that and it's truly remarkable, is that 60% of all households have a JEEViKA member in Bihar. So all rural households. So and so that's basically 12 million households, 1 million self-help groups. So that's 10 lakh self-help groups, 1.2 crore women, all of whom are now part of this thing. So this is, you could have quibbles about, whether this is useful, whether it's not useful, but you cannot ignore the scale of this. This is kind of remarkable in scale. Next slide. And so the question then is, of course, can JEEViKA then be a platform that empowers marginalized women? Remember, these are also groups that initially at least privileged members of Dalit and ST backgrounds. Bihar has very few scheduled tribes, so primarily STs, scheduled castes, Dalits are the main beneficiaries of this program. There's qualitative, actually very powerful stories of empowerment. Biju Rao did a bunch of work around JEEViKA in the early 2010s, and some of those stories are both moving. I would recommend reading some of their papers on this, are very moving about, these, say, women from extremely marginalized caste groups. So there's a story of, I think, I forget her name, but she's from the Dome caste, who basically was called by her mukhya because she was demanding some work or something from that person, and that person the mukhya got really angry and said, "Who are you to come to my house and ask me for benefits?" And she says, "Who am I? You ask any woman in this mohalla what my name is, and they'll say," I'm just going to come up with a name, I think Rekha Devi or whatever. They'll say Rekha Devi. You ask anyone in the block office who I am, they'll say Rekha Devi. You ask anyone in the district office who I am, and they'll say Rekha Devi. So, this ability to kind of use your collective strengths to push back against power or sources of local power is something that's kind of inherent to many of these stories documented. The quantitative evidence, trust a quantitative person to rain on everybody's parade, but there's the quantitative evidence is a bit more mixed. Datta finds Upamanyu Datta's work is very interesting. He's done a lot of work on this and finds improvements in mobility decision making. But there's a more recent piece of work that argues that the initial amount of 30,000 is just too small to empower JEEViKA women to kind of change their intra-household bargaining strength. So maybe they do have other ways in which they're empowered, but it's the 30,000 is not big enough. And there are other states that have higher initial amounts, and those kind of are better at giving women an upper hand within the household. So, so this is what we have in terms of quantitative evidence. Some work that we are beginning to do, and this is with Imon Sen, who's a grad student at Maryland in my department. We asked, does JEEViKA kind of result in kind of political empowerment? And in particular, are more women and SCs contesting in Panchayat elections in places where JEEViKA exists? So that's the big question we're asking. And we have very early results. We're kind of excited about what we are seeing, but there's a lot more work to be done. But let me just show you what we have. Next slide. So the empirical strategy is that, as I told you, JEEViKA expanded across panchayats over time quite dramatically. We will use the expansion to see if panchayats with JEEViKA in 2015, that is about a year before the elections, throw up more women or SC candidates in the 2016 election. So very simple strategy. You compare two types of panchayats. In one panchayat, you had an SCG group for at least 1 year, in some cases more years. At least one group. That's all we're looking at. Nothing kind of dramatic or big. In other panchayats, you had a JEEViKA group for at most 1 year. In most cases, less than 1 year. And usually, the first year is kind of a year of struggle. You're still kind of trying to build a group. You're trying to understand each other. You're still trying to access the funds. And so, for the econometrically inclined, this is just a simple ordinary least squares with fixed effects. Next slide. And so, this is the first result. JEEViKA kind of improves political participation. We are seeing that, and this is kind of 95% confidence intervals, but only in conjunction with reservation. What does this graph tell you? So the first dot you see right at the top says that any SAG in 2015, the presence of any SAG in 2015 doesn't change, doesn't actually result in more women kind of contesting elections. However, if you just look at places that were reserved for women, that has 11 extra candidates. That makes sense because, if it's a reserved seat, of course, you only find only women candidates. So that's 11 more candidates than the average panchayat. But in places that had both, so where you had reservation and you had an SHG, you see about 0.8 extra candidates per panchayat in the elections. Now that may seem like a small number, but think of the fact that there are 4,000 reserved panchayats in Bihar. So 0.8 times 4,000 is 3,200 extra women candidates contesting elections just because JEEViKA has been in those panchayats for at least a year or more, right? So it shows that there's some political empowerment that's happening here. Next slide. And now you can kind of look at the same thing for Dalits. So you can look at, and again, we find strikingly similar results. If you're looking at just the presence of SHGs, it doesn't mean that you're having more kind of Dalits candidates contesting in elections. The more Dalit candidates contest elections in reserved seats, that's again mechanical. You have 13 candidates in every reserved seat. But in places where you have both reservation and you have Dalit and you have SHG presence, you have additional 0.44 candidates. Again, think of the fact that there are 1,300 reserved panchayats, so that's another 500 candidates overall, where that you can kind of attribute to the presence of JEEViKA. So JEEViKA is kind of resulting in, next slide, some kind of political empowerment. And this is happening only in conjunction with there being some kind of reservation. This is actually, and this is actually a subject of a much longer talk, and I have about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to go into it. But this is partly because JEEViKA's work largely lies outside the ambit of the Panchayati Raj institutions. It's a decision that was made very early to kind of protect, in some sense, JEEViKA from all the outside quote unquote bad forces. And so JEEViKA kind of exists in a bubble of its own. It's funded by the bank. It has its own hierarchy. It has its own rules. And so they don't really engage. These women don't necessarily always engage or not required to engage with Panchayati Raj institutions. All the work that they do, even with respect to, making masks and stuff, requires very little coordination with local government institutions. They're almost seen as doing their own thing. However, the vision for JEEViKA is going forward is to kind of do more of integrating with Panchayati Raj institutions. Part of the reason this is happening is that at some point, the World Bank support and the government support for these self-help groups is going to be removed, and that's going to happen very soon in the next few years. When that happens, these groups have to sustain themselves, and one of the ways they could sustain themselves is to kind of integrate themselves more into the day-to-day kind of development life of the panchayat in some sense. So, so that's the broad takeaway on the JEEViKA front. Next slide. And so actually I had the bridge line that was supposed to connect what I said earlier to this slide was basically that, okay, so you have JEEViKA resulting in some kind of empowerment, but it's kind of unclear that JEEViKA alone can do a lot. That's what, the qualitative evidence is mixed, and the quantitative evidence suggests that there's some in this one. And that's partly because JEEViKA exists in a bubble of its own. Now, what would it mean to kind of come out into your own and kind of act in a more kind of straightforward manner with local government institutions? So there I'm going to give you an example from the Muzaffarpur People's Movement. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. I think you have the old version of the slide deck. I'm just going to, can you go to the next slide? I have a feeling the slide deck. Yeah. Okay, go back. We can just pause at this. And I'll just talk now because I'm sorry. I think the slide deck is the older version of the deck. For some reason, it was my fault. It was not saved, I'm guessing, before I sent it. But the Muzaffarpur People's Movement is kind of important because it's an example of kind of organic collective action that kind of sprung from below, right? So there was no kind of state support, like in the case of JEEViKA, it was not state mandated like reservations. Essentially, this was the kind of almost by chance. I talk about this, I've written about this previously. And what happened was there was this one person from a village, Sanjay Sani, who discovered corruption in his village and decided to go back. This was in the NREGA, the Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And he decided to kind of start a movement where he encouraged local wage laborers to demand better work under the NREGA. And this is a movement that's gone on for over nearly a decade. And the startling thing about this movement is that it's almost completely homegrown. It's run by someone who's a class 7 kind of fail, who was a child migrant laborer himself. And it is dominated by members of Dalit and marginalized caste groups. Now we have data to kind of show that over 75% of people, members of this movement are all Dalits. So that's kind of remarkable. But also the way that the movement works is much more agitational than, say, what JEEViKA does. When I say agitational, what do I mean? You essentially get local workers to kind of come together and demand that the mukhya, the head of the panchayat, gives NREJ work, gives housing, gives ration, gives pensions. And so this is kind of collective petitioning, filing for applications at the block office for job cards. So this is kind of old-fashioned, collective action that requires a lot of open confrontation with members of the local government and the local hierarchies. And so this is much more confrontational, but perhaps that's precisely why it's very hard to scale, because there's a lot of backlash, right? So you can imagine a case where, you have these marginalized caste group women coming together, pressing their local leaders to kind of, and demanding more of them, and then you'll see backlash. And so the movement kind of grows and falls and grows and falls. And right now it's in over 200 panchayats. In fact, the thing I'm kind of excited about is that we're actually studying in a more quantitative way their expansion to 120 new panchayats. So we're actually seeing how is it that they go into these panchayats, the old teams of these members of this movement go into newer panchayats. How do they get women to kind of come together and petition the local state? We're also documenting strikes. We're documenting network effects, like who's the first person enrolled, who's the second, who's the third, and kind of stuff like that. And I think that just to kind of bring it back to both JEEViKA and local government, there are kind of lessons that especially JEEViKA can kind of learn from this kind of more open, I don't want to say confrontational and agitational, but open petitioning, at least, of the local state, because JEEViKA is a platform that exists everywhere. The Muzaffarpur movement suffers from a lack of scale, but JEEViKA is in every single panchayat, and there are 30, 40 groups in a panchayat. So if you could imagine a more radicalized version of JEEViKA where they could actually petition the local state, you could imagine the gains to be quite substantial. So that's one thing that I'm going to throw out there. There are problems with that kind of thinking, but I want to kind of say that I think that's a way going forward. I also have a bunch of open questions that I had in the slide deck earlier. One of them was, we see all of this happening, but the question with the people's movement is, how do they kind of go from 3 districts to more districts? Is it even possible? Is it even something that they should care about? How does the people's movement interact with politics, local politics and local government politics? Think of it this way, right? You are openly agitating against a local state for 5 years, and then the elections come around, and then you become member of a local state. There's a contradiction there. And how does one resolve the contradiction? I have a lot of thoughts on this, but that's maybe a separate talk. But those are the kind of open questions. And so therefore, I think I'm almost out of time. So to kind of quickly summarize, this talk basically has talks about 3 ways of kind of empowering the marginalized. One is reservations, which is kind of top down, can't be applied everywhere. And so therefore we can, but it has big effects, right? And it works in a whole host of places, and it really helps both marginalized kind of improve their asset gains, but also political empowerment. But it can't be applied everywhere. And, there are kind of issues of where it works really well and where it doesn't work. And so in other places, you need kind of more bottom-up forces, either through the state like JEEViKA or through, more organic movements. And, eventually going forward, I think, some kind of interaction, kind of combination of these things will lead to the greatest benefits. There are still many open questions about many of these topics, at least questions that in my mind are open. And I hope to hear what Rahul has to say and all your questions and thoughts. Thank you.
So thank you, Sharan, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Lawrence and CHS, for inviting me. And thank you, Sharan, for this non-econ talk and making things accessible to all of us. So since you did mention about causal identification and other things, and I'm sure all the robustness checks must have been taken care of, I will focus much more on the substantive part of your argument rather than the econometric parts. And I'll also try to link it with your book, Last Among Equals. So Those of you who have not read his book, please do. It's a sales pitch. But the idea is simple. Like why? So when I read it, and we have been having a conversation on not just his book, but what to do about sort of like building a research project on local governance in India, especially now that 73rd and 74th Amendment Act has had 30 years, right? And so it's time to basically look for long-term effects of some of the radical promises that 73rd, 74th Amendment made. It's one of the most bold documents in that sense about decentralization. And so far, especially coming from US economics, it seems that decentralization has done wonders to the country, right? Most of the analysis that we have seen or read of affirmative action policies or decentralization measures, there are stories or instances of clientelism, some null effect, but largely things have changed positively, right? And while I agree with that there are some improvements, but to the extent I think the effects of those improvements don't seem to be visible, right? So yes, there may be like, 0.8% more candidates that are contesting in once you take off the reservation. And that we know from not just from rural areas of Bihar. Remember Rikhil Bhavnani's study from Mumbai, and then 2004 Chattopadhyay Duflo study. So the big picture story on reservation from all the research has been that it had an empowering effect, both in terms of provision of public goods, in terms of how many candidates that can run to office, even when reservations are lifted. But to my mind, like, we don't know how much pipeline has been formed. Like, are these people actually able to contest assembly elections, or they remain at the local level? So pipeline story, one can say that there is no data or evidence to it. But given what we know about how assembly elections and Lok Sabha elections are contested, especially the kind of resources that is needed, I'm not sure whether the pipeline story has been created or not. Second, where I think, and I like, you have few of these things in your book, and this may be peculiar to some states like Bihar, where panchayat elections are not contested on party lines, right? And so there are states where parties are important, for example, West Bengal or Kerala in panchayat elections, or Karnataka as well, but some states like UP and Bihar don't have parties. Can we imagine sort of like this build up from panchayat to the like empowerment story to assembly and Lok Sabha without the parties? And this is not just I think a weakness of the literature, which has been basically for last 30 years have been producing work on decentralization, but it's basically imagines a partyless scenario. And so, and this also complex, for example, and this is my issue with when we only look at the decentralization from the positive aspect. Because there is this positive stories are sort of like some normative aspects attached to it. And so everything might be happening, like only good outcomes of federalism and decentralization, but not even touching on what negative fallouts would be. So two things from your own presentation. Can a political party use JEEViKA for its own mobilization, right? Can a political party penetrate a self-help group and then use for its own political purposes? And that's the first problem. Second, and I think I wasn't clear, maybe like when you presented that, what I would see as a inverted U-shaped relationship between SC population and benefit. And you said things are better in the middle, which is right. And so I can understand why when the population is low, the benefits are marginal. But what happens when the population is fairly large, right? Which also, and my worry is not where I think there is a negative story there, not that they're not getting benefit, I think it might also be creating a cycle of resistance and violence, right? When you have a large group, and if it's trying to suddenly change the natural order of hierarchy, which you've talked about in your book, that will also attract resistance and some sort of violence. And so one part of, again, the decentralization literature misses is the violence which might be getting created at the local level. Because in some ways, and I again, this is a thinking aloud and others people can reflect. Suddenly what has happened in these 30 years, like every fifth household of the village is a family of, like someone in the family is contesting election, right? So everyone is becoming sort of like part of electoral politics. And we just had a survey where we asked about nascent political ambition, which is, if you get a chance to contest election, would you like to contest? And so bottom half of the society is more likely to contest election. Women, less educated, poor, lower caste. Again, I can't find the, the mechanism argument. You could take it as it is and say it's a logic of empowerment. People see politics and democracy offering things to them, but it could be simply a story of all the evils that we see in, not evils would be a very strong word, but like corruption and money and violence at state level. And it might be also percolating at the panchayat level, where people want to become politicians because then they can extract resources. So in some ways, recent, and this is a long, like 200-year-old debate, Federalist Paper number 10, talking about what can be the ill effects of decentralization, right? So I think that would be my sort of like second thrust, which is parties are somewhere missing in the story. The third and the final point would be this interaction between sort of like, so leave party aside, but thinking about the state, and state of Bihar is in that sense unique state, right? Like some would argue that in 90s, it was on the verge of collapse, and it regains, which you talked about in your book, at least the first few years of Nitish Kumar's regime, there was a winner of a state, anything small getting done, and great, Bihar is now basically on the march of sort of rising again. One can have debates what he did between 2010 and 2020, but in such a state where things collapsed, then anything small would be seen like a very positive development, which is not, now the argument is not on the causal estimates and other things, but do panchayats work in a similar way, or do they end up doing better when the local state or the state capacity is actually stronger? And so many of the negative outcomes. So what I'm trying to say, basically, if you try to fit in a good policy in a bad system, the outcome can actually be more dramatically negative than actually positive. And finally, just to link to all of this, where, the party, state, and then the argument about movements. And we had a kind of a conversation on Sanjay Sahni and why, in my opinion, movements and electoral politics are two different domains. In fact, what I think is currently happening in India, you will continue to see more movements happening. So some people may read that, oh, this democracy is alive and kicking. I see that as failure of political parties to absorb the sentiments that are coming from the ground. And so even the biggest movements will mobilize 5 lakh, 7 lakh people, whereas the smallest assembly constituency is a mobilization of 8 to 10 lakh voters, right? So these two operate at a very, very different level. And I don't know, those who lead movement, when they get into electoral politics, will they carry the same? So because at the end, you had a positive thrust again on the movement, as if movement will always lead to positive outcomes. I will see it as an instrument of an entrepreneur to basically get in power, right? And once, so in a logic of social movement, your language is going to be very, very different. And in a logic of electoral politics, the language is very different. In recent Gujarat Assembly election 5 years ago, those who were leading movements, their language was very different than in this election. Right. And so I'll just rest my case here.
So Sharan, so first of all, thank you very much, Rahul, for your comments. So what I suggest is that we take maybe 7 minutes to respond, and then we can open the floor to questions. Is that okay?
We can do that also.
I think you've had quite a few questions that Rahul has raised. So
Okay.
we can easily take 7 minutes, and then we can move on to the Q&A.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll keep it short because Rahul and I have gone back and forth on this a bit before. But let me start with the political parties critique. I think that's, here I'm in agreement in the sense that it's a thing that I've thought about a bit. Formally, many states ban political parties from even entering the Panchayat elections fray. And what that basically results in is a broken ladder in some sense that, you win the local ward elections, which is the lowest tier, and then you kind of maybe contest the Mukhya elections, and that's great. And maybe you will go up to the block level or the Zilla Parishad elections, and then you kind of stop. It's not all of you go up all the way, and it's very hard to kind of leapfrog from there into the MLA or the MP election. So there is a kind of a problem. And if you think of a system, you think of any system, what you want is to have like some kind of a funnel that allows the best local political entrepreneurs to kind of rise up the ranks and eventually kind of come to power in a big way, and that you're not seeing in this. I think the trade-off, if I had to play devil's advocate, the big trade-off there is, of course, that in some sense you think that the party system and all that you're seeing at the higher levels with the MLAs and the MPs is kind of all this corruption and all this money entering is kind of bad, and so therefore you want to kind of protect the Panchayati Raj system from the evils of the larger party system and the money. And if you bring in parties into the political fray at the local level, then at some level you'll begin to kind of have this problem where parties will mobilize at bigger and bigger scales, which means that maybe 10 years, 15 years from now, and this is just a conjecture, I'm not endorsing this argument, but maybe 10 to 15 years from now, you will start seeing people auctioning tickets even to contest at the Panchayat level, because, that's how parties kind of function. So, and that's already happening in the absence of parties, right? So we do know now that to contest for the Mukhya elections in places like Bihar, you kind of have to put in at least 5 to 10 lakhs. And that's Bihar. So imagine now if you were a kind of a small-time contractor in a village like 20 kilometers from Bangalore, you're probably putting in up to 1 crore to kind of contest the Panchayat elections, because you know that that land is going to be valuable and people are going to come to you when you become the Panchayat head. So so that's my take on parties. I'm conflicted. I don't have a strong stance either way. But let me talk a bit about this whole political selection angle, which is that who becomes a politician at the Panchayat level. So what we actually find, and this is to your point that, when you survey women and Dalits, they have more nascent political ambition. We find, this is very early stage work, this is Apurva and some other people, we find that at the lowest level, at the ward level, wealth is actually, or poverty status or education is negatively correlated with actual contesting. So that is to say that at the ward level, the poorer households are more likely to contest. But as soon as you get to the Mukhya level, the political, the financial barriers are high enough that, you're now kind of selecting a richer pool of households. So you're seeing this so what you're saying is different from, it's a different outcome in the sense that you're looking at nascent political ambition, which is stated ambition. What I'm looking at is actual outcomes in the terms of whether people contest or not. And we are seeing this kind of thing where at higher levels, wealth still plays a role in determining, and richer people are likely to contest. That being said, and I have to run the numbers cleanly on this, but it is true that Dalits are more likely to want to enter politics, and there are reasons for this. Imagine a world where you had a circumscribed set of opportunities to kind of enjoy, which is the case with Dalits, but then you have this political forum where 16% of seats, which is exactly in proportion of your population, is reserved especially for you. So that's one avenue where you're actually not kind of blocked off from. But whereas if you wanted to apply for a private sector job, or you wanted to kind of work somewhere, because of all these other structural reasons, you can't even participate. So what do you do then? You kind of pile on, and you kind of, the few avenues that are open, you kind of go there. So that's my take on some of that stuff. On the backlash question, I think this is if I had to pick one thing that people should kind of focus a lot on going forward, is this whole backlash question in terms of does reservation, do all these policies result in some kind of upper caste backlash? What's happening there? What are the stories? And the problem with some of these things, and like all the big decentralization studies that even you cited, all of them are kind of quantitative, and I think they are unable to get at the more sensitive aspects. So there's some quantitative work on riots which I think are somewhat interesting, but the daily backlash stuff is different, right? You have a threat, you have somebody come into your house, breaking down a compound wall, taking over your land for a short period. We were not able to collect data that kind of talks about this nicely. And I think the qualitative work there is the one that will kind of fill that gap up. But it is a big question. Like, you're reserving, just to reiterate, Bihar has 16% Dalits, 20% EBCs, up to 50% women reserved seats. So it's a lot of reservation that's kind of come in, and a lot of threat to the local entrenched elites who, for in the absence of reservation in Bihar in 2001, less than 1% of seats were won by Dalits. So, Dalits just, and that's true for EBCs, that's true for women. So what this is doing is fundamentally changing the structure of society, and it's unimaginable that there is no backlash. And you're completely right that it's a lacuna in the research right now, and we should try and fill it. On the what happens to parties when they movements when they enter, and when they enter political parties, or when they become, I think this is one of the biggest critiques that I have of kind of being part of local elections that I've seen from members of social movements themselves. So there's a image in the wrong slide deck I showed you of Mandesri Devi. Mandesri Devi, actually, I met her. This is a story from August last year. Not August, was it August? Yeah, August or something. And I was telling her, why aren't you contesting elections? Like, you are a local social activist, you are popular, at least contest the ward elections, you will win. And she said something like, she said two things. She said, if I win, I'll become greedy. Hum lalchi ho jayenge. So, and I was like, the fact that you're saying this suggests to me that perhaps you can kind of control some of that, yeah. But the other thing she also said was, she said, if all of us enter government, who's going to question it from the outside? Which I thought was also a very nice articulation of what it meant to be a civil society activist outside the kind of local political arena. And so your critique that people who contest and win elections, they are not they from these movements, they may kind of go on to the dark side, quote unquote. It's well taken. I'll say this though, that amongst the the biggest supporters of the Muzaffarpur movement, for example, are these old left kind of activist / party members who come for all the strikes, who kind of help mediate kind of conversations between members of the movement, especially in the early days in the government, and nobody would vote for them. So because they said that these people are going to be with us irrespective of whether we vote for them or not, they're going to serve us, so we might as well vote in the Yadav contractor who will probably build the well or whatever it is that we want. So so what I'm trying to say through that kind of anecdote is that so it may also just be mechanically true that as much as movements try to kind of be part of the political process, nobody will vote for them for these reasons. So and that's something to kind of think about. Okay, so those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now open the floor to questions. So those of you who are online, please do not hesitate to either raise your hands or maybe post a question in the chat box. I'll first, yeah, so we already have questions in the room. So Stephanie, maybe we can take a round of questions. Anyone else wants to have? Yes, okay. Just a point, if you're in the room, when you want to ask a question, please come closer so that you can have access to the mic. So first I'll let.
Thank you very much for a very exciting presentation and discussion. And I start by saying that I agree with you, Rahul, that we have a lot of overly positive accounts of Panchayati Raj results. But I think there is really a true question here. Is local government in India the most democratic space or the least democratic space that we have? Because on the negative side, when you look at the diversity of rules that govern elections in various Indian states, it can be sometimes really scary and very undemocratic. But on the positive side, the sheer scale of Panchayati Raj institutions and the sheer diversity of cases. I mean, you have mentioned Dalits and women, and of course we have other backward class also and scheduled tribes also, makes it a live experiment of democracy. And in this respect, I was very intrigued. I had no idea that local elections under the 73rd and 74th Amendment took place for the first time in 2006 in Bihar. But can it happen without reservations? Reservations were part of the constitutional amendments, weren't they?
Yes, but they
Okay. Okay. So that's very interesting, and I really would like to know if you can spend some time on it. Who was pushing the case for the independence of Dalit Republic in the courts, and was it a pretext then to postpone further elections? I mean, we can see that in Maharashtra today with.
Sharan, like Nitish Kumar launched a special dedicated program for the Mahadalit in Bihar in 2007. So, did the Bihar Mahadalit Vikas Mission did a significant role in the upward mobility of Mahadalits on regarding caste class mobility? Did Bihar Mahadalit program that did contributed any significant in their role? And my second question is that even after the local self-government, there is like when we talk of Mahadalits in textual concept or in a literature, there is a large gap what we read in the text and what we experience in the ground reality. So how do we address that lacking?
Yeah, should I answer? Okay, great. So thanks for the fantastic comments. There's a lot to chew on there, but let me kind of talk about a few things. So the question on why was there no reservation before 2006 in Bihar? As I told you, there was a court case, but who were the people? So the court case is interesting because officially it says Janardhan Paswan and others versus the state of Bihar. Paswan is a Dalit surname, but I'm guessing the and others is the crucial part of that, this one. And I could not find the list of petitioners. But when the 2006 reservations finally were introduced, there was a slew of court cases that were filed in the High Court, all of which was quashed. And those were predominantly upper caste surnames. So there you can see some Singh, some Pandey, like, you see the standard Thakur, Bhumihar, Rajput surnames that are kind of dominating people who are filing court cases against it. I can point you to, if you're interested, I can show you some of the, yeah. So it's actually, I spent a lot of time reading some of this material. When I wrote a book, I wrote a chapter in my book on the path to reservations. So just this particular path. So I'll share some stuff from there. In terms of how is women's reservation implemented? So in that figure I showed you, so what they do is, so first let me tell you how it happens. So imagine you had to reserve 3 panchayats for Dalits in a block. They basically reserve 50% of that of those 3 panchayats for women. So up to 50%, so it will be 1 panchayat that's going to be reserved for women. Now, which of those 3 will be reserved for women? It's not a draw of lots. What they do is they take the 3 panchayats to be reserved for Dalits and they arrange them in descending order of population. And the highest population one gets reserved for women, and the remaining don't. So it's basically, so you could do exactly what I was doing with this thing, where I can look at, the panchayats reserved for women versus the one that was not reserved, that are really close in population of SCs. And you can kind of do the same study. We didn't do it. It's on our agenda of things to do, but we can then also measure, for example, the effects of female reservation in panchayats. Yeah. 10 years. So it's exactly the same. So that's basically why I think we're seeing a lot of these results, because you had a reservation for 10 years. There's some other work for female reservation that shows that if you look at, and that shows, basically it shows that parents' aspirations for their children kind of go up dramatically when there's reservation for women. This is Lori Beeman and others. And what they show is that if it's only for 1 term, you don't see the changes. It only happens when you have 2 terms of reservation. That's when kind of aspirations and role model effect kind of kicks in at that point. And the comment on invited spaces was the invented spaces is very well taken. I should do more to kind of think along those lines. I've written down here something to do with size of jurisdiction. I think it's related to your first point, but I've forgotten what the first thing you said. I think it was something to do with, I can't remember, but we can talk about this later. And then on the Mahadalits question, so that's a great question. I think the Mahadalit Vikas Mission has done a lot of good work. This is my take. I have no empirical ways of kind of showing you how they have done the good work, but the fact that you carved out a separate mission only for Mahadalits, the fact that you have allocated resources, you've taken your best bureaucrats and kind of made them think about these issues, all of this suggests to me that it will have some bearing on the ground. The fact that you have Vikas Mitra, yeah, right. Mm. Mm.
They do not go to their homes, they do not talk to them. So, like what we see in the text, like what we read, the government report, data, that is totally different from the
What you see on the ground.
So, such like we get but when we go to the ground, but there is nothing like that seems.
So this is related to Rahul's earlier point also, which is that where is all this visible? I think that's basically the point that even he made when he talked about decentralization and its positive effects. So yeah.
I think there is a story of change in 30 years. There is a positive story of change, and things have definitely changed, and a lot of positive impact of reservation, both for women as well as for Dalits. I think what I was trying to play a bit sort of like contrarian.
Right.
A small pushback on
Right.
too much positive story.
Yeah.
But
No, but this is a thing that a lot of people kind of, this is a pushback that you get often, right? Like, I have seen a bunch of places, I don't see any of this happening. But I think the question to think about is, if it's there in every single panchayat, and let's say it works in 1 out of 8 panchayats, so that's 12%, 13%, that's still 13% Vikas Mitras who are kind of doing change. So if you look at the bigger scale, which is, right. 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 Yeah, of course. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 So let me say one last thing here. Yeah.
So I think we also get what negative sides. See, there are two things that I just wanted to add to Sharan's point. One, the power of method seizure, which is it should be able to take care of many of the concerns that you have, right? Because it's actually at the end of the day estimated effects between two very similarly looking things, unless you can point us out that the data in those places are just biased, right? So it's like, so on a statistical side, it's hard to question the way you work there. The second issue is, which is we tend to overplay this Pradhanpati argument. Yes, it is true that it happens where females are faced, but if you follow the same females on like a 5 to 10 year, you will see a lot of females actually defecting and becoming more empowered and raising questions, right? So the stories basically on like in the middle, not basically saying all females have become empowered or Pradhanpati.
Things are changing, but
Very slowly. That's a yeah. But so I just also want to note that classic party studier Rahul says defecting for a wife. So yeah, no, but great questions. And there's two people. One last thing, Himanshu Kumar and Rohini Somnathan have a paper on Vikas Mitra. Just look for that paper. They've been writing it for a long time, but there's a draft that's floating around somewhere. And then there's, I think Apurva here is working. She's right behind you. She's working on Vikas Mitra. So you should, yeah. So you should, yeah. And she also has a paper on elected proxy versus non-proxy. So, you know, all the questions that you have, you know, so, but all great questions. And I don't think they're invalid.
So we are running slightly short of time, but maybe we can take one or two short questions.
Okay.
And maybe Rahul at the end, if you want to respond to maybe Stephanie's, it's great that you could respond to these latter comments, but if you want to respond also to Stephanie's comments, just in case. Yes. So anyone else would like to ask a question? Okay, great. So we have one more question and then.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for such a enlightening presentation. And my question is related with the social capital kind of aspect. That in Bihar, social capital is generating from the top through the project JEEViKA. But when we see the basic idea about the social capital, that social capital takes root in India in the 1990s when there is a withdrawal of state, you know. But in the case of Bihar, the state is engaging in generating kind of social capital of things. So how do you see this kind of phenomenon? First, and second, that one thing that is related with the project JEEViKA, and that is very much is behind the success of that project JEEViKA in Bihar, that it basically generates self-help group on the basis of interest. People are basically want to be the part of self-help group because of their certain kind of developmental interest. So they are lagging behind their identity-based kind of things and coming together. And we see there are various self-help group where women from Brahmin community, women from the lower caste community, and coming together. And it shows a kind of progressive kind of mechanism through which we can understand the self-help group politics. And it is a kind of progression in terms of understanding Bihar rural politics in terms of caste-based identity. And in your study, you are just conceptualizing the positive kind of aspects related with the caste-based identity to this kind of change through the project JEEViKA. So this two query belongs.
So, so let me start with the second one, which is that, you know, the fact that JEEViKA mobilizes women out of interest. I think it's both a great thing and also not a great thing that for 30,000 rupees as rolling fund, you have 60% of households enrolling women. So you could see the same thing as a way of saying, oh my God, the initial capital is so small, yet people are so not well off that they are willing to kind of show up for these meetings every week and participate in these activities. You could imagine another state, maybe Kerala or something, where people won't show up for that kind of money, right? So that's just like, pushing back a bit on what you were saying. I'm not saying what you're saying is incorrect, but that's one point. In terms of positive and negative aspects of decentralization or of the story that I was presenting, I think one of the things, and I didn't spend too much time on that, we do find evidence of clientelism in the sense that we do find the case that, mukhyas favor people who look like them or who are from their own background. So that's something we find. It's a kind of thing that, is a classic critique. In fact, outside of this room, everybody will probably be making this claim that reservation is a waste because only people close to the mukhya benefit, right? So I think part of the reason we highlight the positive stuff is also because those are the things that are kind of surprising to the average person, and not the fact that you see some of these things that everybody kind of knows. So that's one way of thinking about it. In terms of state creating social capital, and you're saying that, I think it's a great question. What exactly is JEEViKA trying to do? I think the limitations of JEEViKA stems from the fact that it is state created. The fact that the positives, and it's like a double-edged sword. You get the scale because you're with the state, but you also get kind of these small impacts and a lot of groups kind of not doing much because it is, how can you question the state if you're created by the state? You're birthed by the state. So then that's the contradiction that I think JEEViKA is unable to kind of fully overcome. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharan and Rahul, for the wonderful presentation and then discussion. And thank you all for your questions. So let me now announce our next session. So we will meet on 23rd January. We will have a historian this time, Nikhil Menon from the University of Notre Dame, who will come to present his book entitled Planning Democracy, How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India. Thank you again.
Thank you.